Right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming along to our last session for today. Today's session is a half-hour talk, which is all that's been scheduled. And if you have to leave at the end of that, totally fine. Although we might have a couple of questions for Jenna that will go a bit beyond 5:30 because the session isn't being used. So just up to you if you want to hang around for that. Jenna Ong is the co-creator of Insights for Impact, a YouTube channel which works on communicating research insights for positive impact in the form of documentary style, entertaining and explanatory videos. She was also the co-founder of Effective Altruism Canberra. Please welcome Jenna.
Hello. So I want to start with a question for you. When it moves, sorry. Suspense.
What the?
Maybe I should restart it. Good old off and on.
This is bizarre. I have not had this not work.
Oh, there it is. It's working.
Well done, whatever you did.
You did that. How are you doing?
Good.
Yay! I ask because I care about your well-being and because I find this question very important and interesting. Among other things in the field of well-being science or research, I am interested in more precise measures of how much suffering people are experiencing and how we can truly successfully increase well-being, not relying so much on indirect proxies for well-being. So when I say well-being, I mean that which is truly valuable, not an instrumental goal like money or equal opportunity or anything on the left there. Well-being in my lexicon is the inherent underlying end goal of any valuable task or action. After all, if our actions don't ultimately lead to well-being for people or animals, or maybe AI if they have well-being, I don't know if anyone can call that talk, then what are they for? What are our actions for if not for that? A government is only good if it supports well-being, work is only productive if it produces well-being, education is valuable where it leads to well-being, and so on. Interestingly, yet not surprisingly, research studies show reverse positive effects. Less happy people tend to support populist parties, well-being increases productivity and problem solving, happy people tend to give more to others, and so on. Back to how you're doing though. This is the main instrument used in the Gallup World Poll, which is the biggest ongoing telephone survey of what's happening in the lives of people around the world. Gallup poll data is in turn used in world happiness studies, like the World Happiness Report. Sorry, not really studies, but research, ongoing research, like the World Happiness Report, which is an annual publication, and the Happy Planet Index, among many other studies. So it's a pretty big deal. Sorry, you don't know what it is yet. But it hinges on one simple question. Imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 at the bottom to 10 at the top. The top of the ladder represents the best possible life you can imagine for yourself, and the bottom represents your worst possible life. On which step of the ladder would you say you personally feel you stand at this time? And on which step do you think you'll stand about 5 years from now? This is the Cantrell ladder, named after Hadley Cantrell in 1965, and researchers have found that people give very similar answers to the question of how satisfied are you with life or how happy are you with life. So we're going to assume that they're interchangeable as measures of subjective well-being. We see here some Gallup poll data of 158 countries. Well, not all 158 are here because I thought it would be too small on the screen, but these are some of the happiest and some of the unhappiest countries based on average scores of that ladder, that Cantrell ladder. This is 2017 to 2019 data, and you can see there, like, Finland is pretty high at, like, laser, at 7.8 on average, and Afghanistan is 2.6. And I'm very interested in uncovering the key factors that contribute to such disparities. Like, what are the real, like, most important, most sort of influencing determinants of that. more on this later. But not everyone agrees that subjective well-being is a good measure. And there is a hot topic in the field of well-being science at the moment to do with comparability. Comparability is this question of whether my 7 out of 10 is the same as your 7 out of 10. Can we really compare subjective well-being scores across people and across countries? So in different languages, maybe the word happiness or well-being or life satisfaction translates to something different in meaning. Do people in different countries have like different kind of scales? So maybe my 7 isn't your 7, maybe our scales are different. And I think it's very interesting how researchers have been going about tackling this interesting problem, because it could be, I think you might agree, it could be really powerful as a measure of how much someone's suffering and whether programs are effective. If an intervention is effective and we can just measure that effectiveness with one simple question of how satisfied are you with life, that's really powerful. So potentially this is a really cool measure of well-being. But there are a few things to nut out. And yeah, one of them is comparability. And yeah, it's quite a hot topic in the space. It's only in the last few years, I think, that researchers have really been trying to find out whether subjective well-being scores are comparable. And there are 2 techniques in particular that stood out to me from the research as being interesting and saying something. For one thing, if subjective well-being scores depend on the language you speak, we would expect that in bilingual countries with decently high equality, people who speak different languages would give different ratings of life satisfaction because they've got different languages. And we might expect that, all else equal, people across countries who speak the same language would have similar life satisfaction. There is no strong evidence that either of these is consistently true, and in some cases it seems the reverse. So for example, in Canada, French speakers report themselves slightly happier than English-speaking Canadians, while average happiness in France is lower than Canada. However, there are probably, I think, too many factors at play here to rely solely on this language test in figuring out how comparable subjective ratings are. So another technique is the use of vignettes, which has been used in about 4 studies so far. As I said, it's pretty early days. In this test, participants see a set of little vignettes, little like descriptions of a fictional character, like this one, and they rate that character from on the Cantrell ladder, from 0 to 10. They give that character a score as to how much they think that character is suffering or thriving. And they also rate their own life satisfaction. And even if, so I think this is like a fairly good test, personally, and I'm keen to hear your thoughts on it, because even if your assessment of this fictional character's well-being is different to mine, we could still use this as kind of anchoring data, they call it. So you can correct for differences in our well-being. So if I give, like, you know, say I'm really pessimistic, and I say my well-being, my life satisfaction score is like 2. And I also give this character like a 2. But you would give them like a 6 or 7, and you also give yourself a 6 or 7. Well, maybe you might just say, I'm a bit pessimistic, and like my actual well-being is probably higher than that. I'd love to tell you about this study about differences between like female and males, well, women and men in terms of how satisfied they are with life, but realizing I'm a bit short on time. So catch me later for some interesting, like a study which did that correction, because women, according to the study Montgomery 2022, women seem to be a bit overly optimistic compared to men, or maybe men were pessimistic. but we could correct for that a bit with these vignettes. So yeah, I think we could debate how much this linear scale accurately measures well-being. My instinct is that it should be used in conjunction with other metrics like physical health measures for a multi-dimensional view of well-being. But I also think subjective well-being scores are in general undervalued, and as we gather more data and scientific insight through tests and surveys and experiments in the field of well-being science or elsewhere, like as we gather more data about the importance of feelings and mental well-being as a measure of impact, I think we should consider incorporating subjective well-being scores more into program evaluations, like GiveWell's cost-effectiveness analyses. So, well-being science has ancient origins. Like Aristotle in 350 BC is probably, the first person to ask what's the good life. There's Chinese philosophers before that as well. Perhaps they were the first, actually. But in the last 40 years or so, well-being science has enjoyed a surge of new data to inform questions like, what are the main factors influencing your quality of life and length of life? How do we measure progress? And how can policymakers use this knowledge to improve the well-being of a population? So far, I haven't seen it being applied very much to philanthropic ventures, and the only organisation that seems to be doing that, I think, is the Happier Lives Institute, who are, actually, tangent, forget that. So, effective altruism is the project of doing the most good, reducing suffering and increasing well-being in the most effective ways. And I don't know whether these guys are talking enough. I want to add one more circle here, which is your personal well-being. There's plentiful research linking happiness and altruism, but besides that, I just want to remind you in this talk that your well-being is intrinsically, inherently valuable in itself. I think it's really vital to keep yourself physically, mentally healthy and to do things that you enjoy. This comes from my experience of some personally quite bad well-being, and my observation is that it's not uncommon in the EA space, and this compels me to highlight it as a priority for anyone who wants to live well and do well. And I think well-being research can help. Okay, so a lot of this talk is informed by the new 2023 book, Wellbeing Science and Policy, by some folks at the Oxford Wellbeing Research Centre. Also, to some extent, the Harvard study of adult development, which is the longest-running longitudinal study of human happiness in the world. And there's a book that was published earlier this year by the founders of that study, and it's really good. And to some extent, I also have some insights from research and articles from the Happier Lives Institute. So, yes, back to this question of why does well-being differ across countries? Well, according to this well-being science textbook, which I don't think is complete and comprehensive, but I think is going in the right direction, the authors there, who are philosophers, economists, in this Wellbeing Research Centre, they think, based on their research, that these are the main factors contributing to those differences across countries in rough order of how much they're impacting those differences. We can debate this, and I think it'd be just interesting too. That said, well-being differences within countries actually is of greater variance, according to Layard and Deneve, Jan Manuel Deneve. And so the authors of that red book, they have found these within country differences, and they have an answer as to what are the main determinants of those differences, what are the main things causing those differences in rough order of importance. note, I think this is based mostly on affluent countries, and I think a lot of investigation is needed to understand well-being differences within low-income countries. So this is perhaps a neglected area of research. And, I'm getting to the end here. I wanted to highlight that well-being science is a lot about, from my perspective, models and measures of well-being, at the moment at least. There are various theories and models of well-being from philosophy. You probably know, like, many of you here, I think, would be fairly familiar with the theories, sort of families of theories of well-being in philosophy. Buddhism and Stoicism are perhaps, arguably, models of well-being, as well as philosophies in themselves and bordering into like religion. And psychology has been developing quite a few theories of well-being. Probably the earliest was Maslow, or maybe Aristotle before that. Probably the most recent is PERMA, which suggests there's like 5 basic building blocks to well-being. That's positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement. There's a lot of these like sort of well-being theories being developed. I don't think many of them are being robustly tested, but observing what we have so far, there seem to be some commonalities across the various models, and the 2 main ones are the biggest contributors to well-being are strong positive relationships and meaning or purpose. I want to dwell a little bit on the strong positive relationships because the Harvard study, which I mentioned earlier, has found that this is the biggest predictor of longevity and good health, long-term health and well-being for people. This is based on 80-something years of data following over 100 people and their descendants, and collecting a hell of a lot of questions on these people, although it is a rather skewed study because it began with only white men, and they're trying to branch out now and capture descendants who are more diverse. But yeah, still, I think it is quite clear from the research so far that community relationships, good connections are very key to well-being, no matter where you are, whether it's a low, middle, a high-income country. Yes, meaning and purpose come up a lot in the research as well. I think some are missing. I think a lot of these theories are very focused on sort of mental well-being and say not very much about physical well-being. Maslow was pretty much the only one in psychology, in the field of psychology, who identified, physical health as a core need. So I find that a little odd. But I'd be keen to hear anybody else's theories of well-being, just to add to my growing understanding of it all. And as for measures of well-being, I could go through, the sort of timeline of measures. So let me know if you're interested in that at some point. But I thought I'd just flash up some key measures of well-being and that are used in economics and to some extent psychology, but I think these are more used in the health economic space and world happiness studies, which I think is a very interesting area, and a lot of work still needs to be done. And that's basically the end of my talk. I'm happy to take questions.
There we go. Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Jenna. Just a reminder, anyone who wants to put a question in the talk card, go for it. But also, we don't have heaps of time, so maybe vote on any questions you're particularly interested in hearing the answers to. The first question I've got here is, you talked about vignettes as ways of anchoring, and then also language subjectivity issues. And this question is wouldn't vignettes face the same language subjectivity issue? because the vignettes, I presume, are in the language that we speak spoken.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, I guess so far the research has only been with you looking at English vignettes. So within an English-speaking population, we have some preliminary data that scores are comparable, but maybe across countries, we don't have that data yet. Because the vignettes might mean something quite different in a different language. I guess if you think the language test beforehand, with the French example, if you think that's pretty sound, then that's some evidence that language doesn't have much to do with it, and that even across languages there's comparability.
Yeah, cool. It looks like in some of your examples you're talking about reflective measures of satisfaction or well-being. How do you think about the question of like moment-to-moment measures of sort of well-being as opposed to reflective measures?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting point also, because there is a lot of debate in psychology and maybe economics as well to do with how to measure subjective well-being accurately, given that when you ask someone how they were feeling yesterday, it's often quite different to if you randomly sampled throughout their day yesterday. I think my head is going to like Daniel Kahneman's research, where he was initially very interested in moment-to-moment experiential happiness. I think the field of psychology experienced this kind of pivot away and then back, where they thought experiential happiness was a better measure of well-being. But then they found that what people really cared about when you asked them was more like the life satisfaction, more cognitive reflection of how their life was going on a whole, as opposed rather than their moment-to-moment experience. So Daniel Kahneman actually left that work and decided, no, actually, I think I care more about like life satisfaction measures. But I think it is still valuable to do that random experience, moment-to-moment sampling as well. Like potentially, tackling the problem from multiple angles is valuable.
Yeah, good. A slightly more technical one here. So I'm wondering if you know of whether or not studies account for self-honesty. And this is in reflection to some of the numbers for different cultures. Some cultures generally maybe not as honest or more open about well-being, or there are societal pressures to be happy or something, making you get skewed results.
Yeah, interesting. I think this is an area that I want to look at more, and I'm sorry I don't have a very good answer here. It's definitely, I would say it's probably one of the hot topics, whether people are accurately, truthfully reporting their happiness level. And that, I actually kind of want to make that my next research aim. Thank you for whoever asked that.
Another thing you mentioned in the talk was that income levels correlate with well-being, and so generally higher income is better. Do you think there are ways of bringing people out of poverty that decrease well-being, but that we're not aware of due to not measuring life satisfaction?
Sorry, can you repeat that last bit?
Oh, sorry. Ways of bringing people out of poverty that decrease well-being, but that we're not aware of due to our lack of measurement.
I think potentially. I don't know exactly what, but I think the way that we're currently measuring success in interventions is potentially quite flawed, because we're not taking into account how people say they're doing. We're just going off objective observations of how we think they're doing, rather than giving them the voice to say, yeah, this is actually improving my life. I don't want to call out any particular solutions that, sorry, I have to think about any particular interventions that might be even harmful to people, because we're not really measuring success in the right way.
But do you think that wellbeing science is in a good enough place that EAs should already be taking it into account?
I think some aspects of it. So I think subjective well-being should be one of the standard measures used in conjunction with others. there is already like robust evidence that it correlates with many other metrics. So, like the Gallup poll data, for example, looks at people's incomes as well as like their education and their community support and their like freedom to make decisions in their country. So it like compares life satisfaction scores with many other factors in people's lives, and there seems to be a really good correlation between objective, also like how people's friends think they're doing seems to accord with how they say they're doing. And so I think there's like robust evidence that subjective well-being is like a pretty good measure of flourishing or suffering, but it shouldn't be the only one used.
Great. I think that's all we have time for, but I imagine you'll be here if anyone has more questions.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Jenna.